We're starting the Spiderwick Chronicles Book 2, Chapter 1, in which more than a cat goes missing. The late bus dropped Jared Grace at the bottom of his street. From there, it was an uphill climb to the dilapidated old house where his family was staying until his mother found something better, or his crazy old aunt wanted it back. The red and gold leaves of the low-hanging trees around the gate made the gray shingles look forlorn. The place looked as bad as Jared felt. He couldn't believe he had had to stay after school already. It wasn't like he didn't try to get along with the other kids. He just wasn't good at it. Take today, for example. Sure, he had been drawing a brownie while the teacher was talking, but he was still paying attention, more or less. And she didn't have to hold up his drawing in front of the whole class. After that, the kids wouldn't stop bothering him. Before he knew it, he was ripping some boy's notebook in half. He had hoped things would be better at this school, but since his parents' divorce, things had gone from bad to worse. Jared walked into the kitchen. His twin Simon sat at the old farmhouse table with an untouched saucer of milk in front of him. Simon looked up. Have you seen Tibbs? I just got home. Jared went to the fridge and took a swig of apple juice. It was so cold that it made his head hurt. Well, did you see him outside? Simon asked. I've looked everywhere. Jared shook his head. He didn't care about the stupid cat. She was just the newest member of Simon's menagerie. One more animal wanting to be petted or fed or jumping on his lap when he was busy. Jared didn't know why he and Simon were so different. In movies, identical twins got cool powers like reading each other's minds with a look. It figured that the most real-life twins could do was wear the same size pants. Their sister, Mallory, thundered down the stairs, lugging a large bag. The hilts of fencing swords stuck out from one end. Hey, good job getting detention, nutcase. Mallory slung the bag over her shoulder and walked toward the back door. At least this time, no one's nose got broken. Don't tell Mom, okay, Mal? Jared pleaded. Whatever. She's gonna find out sooner or later. Mallory shrugged and headed out onto the lawn. Clearly, this new fencing team was even more competitive than the last. Mallory had taken to practicing at every spare moment. It bordered on obsessive. I'm going to Arthur's library, Jared said and started up the stairs. But you have to help me find Tibbs. I waited for you to get home so you could help. I don't have to do anything. Jared took the stairs two at a time. In the upstairs hall, he opened the linen closet and went inside. Behind the stacks of mothball-packed yellowed sheets was the door to the house's secret room. It was dim, lit faintly by a single window, and had the musty smell of old dust. The walls were lined with crumbling books. A massive desk covered in old papers and glass jars dominated one side of the room. Great Uncle Arthur's secret library. Jared's favorite place. He glanced back at the painting that hung next to the entrance. A portrait of Arthur Spiderwick peered down at him, with small eyes half hidden behind tiny round glasses. Arthur didn't look that old, but he had a pinched mouth and he seemed stuffy. He certainly didn't seem like someone who would believe in fairies. Opening the first drawer on the left-hand side of the desk, Jared tugged free a cloth-wrapped book, Arthur Spiderwick's Field Guide to the Fantastical World Around You. He'd only found it a few weeks before, but already Jared had come to think of it as his. He kept it with him most of the time, sometimes even sleeping with it under his pillow. He would have even brought it to school, but he was afraid someone would take it from him. There was a faint sound inside the wall. Thimble tag? Jared called softly. He could never be sure when the house brownie was around. Jared put the book down next to his latest project, a portrait of his dad. No one, not even Simon, knew that Jared had been practicing drawing. He wasn't very good. In fact, he was awful. But the guide was for recording stuff, and to record well, he was going to have to learn to draw. Still, after today's humiliation, he didn't feel much like bothering. To be honest, he felt like tearing the picture of his father to pieces. There is a fell smell in the air, said a voice close to Jared's ear. Best take care. He whirled around to see a small nut-brown man dressed in a doll-sized shirt and pants made from a dress sock. He was standing on one of the bookshelves at Jared's eye level, holding onto a piece of thread. At the top of the shelf, Jared could see the glint of a silver needle that the brownie had used to rappel down with. Thimbletack, Jared said. What's wrong? Could be trouble. Could be not. Whatever it is, it's what you wrought. What? You kept the book despite my advice. Sooner or later, there'll be a price. You always say that, said Jared. What about the price for the sock you cut up to make your outfit? Don't tell me that was Aunt Lucinda's. Thimbletack's eyes flashed. Do not laugh. Not today. You will learn to fear the Fae. Jared sighed and walked to the window. The last thing he needed was more trouble. Below, he could see the whole backyard. Mallory was close to the carriage house, stabbing at the air with her foil. Further out, near the broken down plank fence that separated the yard from the nearby forest, Simon stood, hands cupped, probably calling for that stupid cat. Beyond that, thick trees obscured Jared's view. Downhill in the distance, a highway cut through the woods, looking like a black snake in tall grass. Thimbletack grabbed hold of the thread and swung over to the window ledge. He started to speak, then just stared outside. Finally, he seemed to get his voice back. Goblins in the wood. Doesn't look good. My warning comes too late. There's no help for your fate. Where? By the fence. Have you no sense? Jared squinted and looked in the direction the brownie indicated. There was Simon, standing very still and staring at the grass in an odd way. Jared watched in horror as his brother started to struggle. Simon twisted and struck out, but there was nothing there. Simon! Jared tried to force the window open, but it was nailed shut. He pounded on the glass. Then Simon fell to the ground, still fighting some invisible foe. A moment later, he disappeared. I don't see anything, he shouted at Thimbletack. What's going on? Thimbletack's black eyes gleamed. I had forgotten. Your eyes are rotten. But there is a way, if you do what I say. You're talking about the sight, aren't you? The brownie nodded. But how come I can see you and not the goblins? We can choose to show what we want you to know. Jared grabbed the guide and ruffled through the pages he knew nearly by heart. Sketches, watercolor illustrations, and notes in his uncle's scratchy handwriting. Here, Jared said. The little brownie leapt from the ledge to the desk. The page beneath Jared's fingers showed different ways to get the sight. He scanned quickly. Red hair, being the seventh son of a seventh son, fairy bathwater? He stopped at the last and looked up at Thimbletack, but the little brownie was pointing excitedly down the page. The illustration showed it clearly, a stone with a hole through the middle, like a ring. With the lens of stone, you can see what's not shown. With that, Thimbletack jumped from the desk. He skittered across the floor toward the door to the linen closet. We don't have time to look for rocks, Jared yelled. But what could he do except follow? Chapter 2, in which several things are taken, including a test. Thimbletack sprinted across the lawn, hopping from shadow to shadow. Mallory was still fencing against the wall of the old carriage house, her back to where Simon had been. Jared walked up behind her and tugged the headphones off her ears by the cord. She turned, foil pointing at his chest. What? Simon's been grabbed by goblins. Mallory's eyes narrowed. She looked around the lawn. Goblins? Must make haste. Thimbletack's voice was as shrill as birds. No time to waste. Come on, Jared gestured toward the carriage house where the little brownie was waiting, before they get us. Simon! Mallory shouted. Shut up! Jared took her arm and yanked her into the carriage house, closing the door after them. They're going to hear you. Who's going to hear me? Mallory demanded. Goblins? Jared ignored her. Neither one of them had been inside the building before. It smelled of gasoline and mildew. A tarp covered an old black car. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with metal tins and mason jars half filled with brown and yellow liquids. There were even stalls where horses must have been stabled long ago. A stack of boxes and leather trunks occupied one corner. Thimbletack hopped up on a can of paint and pointed toward the boxes. Hurry! Hurry! If they come, we must scurry. If Simon got grabbed by goblins, why are we rooting through the garbage? Mallory asked. Here, Jared said, holding out the book and pointing to the picture of the stone. We're looking for this. Oh, great, she said. It'll be so easy to find in this mess. Just hurry, said Jared. The first truck contained a saddle, a few bridles, some combs, and other equipment for taking care of horses. Simon would have been fascinated. Jared and Mallory opened the next box together. It was full of old, rusted tools. Then they found a few boxes stuffed with tableware, wrapped in dirty towels. Aunt Lucinda must have never thrown out anything, Jared said. Here's another one, Mallory sighed as she dragged a small wooden crate over to her brother. The top slid open in a dusty groove, revealing wadded up newspapers. Look how old these are, Mallory said. This one says 1910. I didn't even think there were newspapers in 1910, said Jared. Inside each crumpled piece of paper was a different item. Jared unrolled one to discover a pair of metal binoculars. In another, he found a magnifying glass. The print below it was made huge. This one's from 1927. They're all different. Jared picked up another page. Girl drowns in empty well. Weird. Hey, look at this. Mallory straightened one of the sheets. 1885. Local boy lost. Says he was eaten by a bear. Look at the surviving brother's name. Arthur Spiderwick. There it is. This is his, Thimbletack said, climbing into the box. When he resurfaced, he held the strangest eyepiece Jared had ever seen. It covered only a single eye and attached to the face with an adjustable nose clip as well as two leather straps and a chain. Backed in stiff brown leather, 4 metal clamps waited to hold a lens of some kind. But the strange thing about the device was the series of magnifying lenses on movable metal arms. So there's the movable arms and the lens. Thimbletack let Jared take the eyepiece and turn it over in his hands. Then he took a smooth stone with a hole through the center from behind his back. The lens of the stone. Jared reached for it. Thimbletack stepped back. Here you must prove yourself, or get nothing from this elf. Jared stared in horror. We don't have time for games. Time or not, you must tell if you will use this stone well. I only need it to find Simon, Jared said. I'll give it right back. Thimbletack cocked an eyebrow. Jared tried again. I promise I won't let anyone use it, except Mallory. And, well, Simon, come on, you're the one that suggested the stone in the first place. A human boy is like a snake. His promises are easy to break. Jared's eyes narrowed. He could feel the frustration and anger rising up in him. His hands curled into fists. Give me the stone. Thimbletack said nothing. Give it to me, Jared, Mallory cautioned. But Jared barely heard her. There was a roaring in his ears as he reached out and grabbed hold of Thimbletack. The little brownie squirmed in his grasp, abruptly changing shape into a lizard, a rat that bit Jared's hand, then a slippery eel that flailed wetly. Jared was bigger, though, and he held fast. Finally, the stone dropped free, hitting the floor with a clatter. Jared covered it with his foot before he let Thimbletack go. The brownie disappeared as Jared picked up the stone. Maybe you shouldn't have done that, said Mallory. I don't care. Jared put his bitten finger in his mouth. We have to find Simon. Does that thing work? Mallory asked. Let's see. Jared held the stone up to his eye and looked out the window. Chapter 3, in which Mallory finally gets to put her rapier to good use. That's her fencing sword. Through the small hole in the stone, Jared saw goblins. There were 5 of them, all with faces like frogs and eyes that were dead white with no pupil at all. Hairless, cat-like ears stuck up from their heads, and their teeth were pieces of shattered glass and small, jagged rocks. Their green, bloated bodies moved swiftly over the lawn. One held a stained sack, while the rest scented the air like dogs, moving in the direction of the carriage house. Jared backed away from the window, almost tripping on an old bucket. They're headed right for us, he whispered, ducking down. Mallory gripped her foil more tightly, knuckles white. What about Simon? I didn't see him. She lifted her head and peered outside. I don't see anything, she said. Jared crouched down with the stone clutched in his palm. He could hear the goblins outside grunting and shuffling as they got closer. He didn't dare look through the stone again. Then Jared heard the sound of old wood snapping. A rock hit one of the windows. They're coming, Jared said. He shoved the guide into his backpack, not bothering to buckle it. Coming, Mallory replied. I think they're here. Claws scraped at the side of the barn and little barks came from beneath the window. Jared's stomach turned to lead. He couldn't move. We have to do something, he whispered. We're going to have to make a run for the house, Mallory whispered back. We can't, Jared said. The memory of the goblin's jagged teeth and claws wouldn't leave him. A couple more planks and they'll be inside. He nodded numbly, steeling himself to rise. Fumbling, he tried to fit the stone into the eyepiece and attach it to its head. The clip pinched his nose. On my mark, said Mallory. 1, 2, 3, go. She opened the door and they both sprinted toward the house. Goblins hurtled after them. Clawed hands caught at Jared's clothes. He wrenched free and ran on. Mallory was faster. She was almost to the door of the house when a goblin caught the back of Jared's shirt and pulled hard. He went down on his stomach in the grass. The stone flew out of the monocle. He dug his fingers into the dirt, holding on as much as he could, but he was being dragged backward. He could feel the clasps on his pack loosening, and he screamed. Mallory turned. Instead of running on toward the house, she started running back to him. Her fencing sword was still in her hand, but there was no way she could know what she was up against. Mallory, Jared shouted. No, run away! At least one goblin must have gone past him because he saw Mallory's arm jerk and heard her cry out. Red lines appeared where nails scraped her. The headphones were ripped free from her neck. She spun and lashed out with the rapier, dealing a stinging blow to the air. It didn't seem like she had hit anything. She swung the sword in an arc, but again, nothing. Jared kicked out hard with one of his legs, striking something solid. He felt the grip that held him slip, and he pulled himself forward, yanking his backpack out of their grasp. The contents spilled out, and Jared was barely able to snatch up the guide in time. Reaching around in the grass, he picked up the stone and scrambled to where Mallory was. Then he brought the stone to his eye and looked. 6 o'clock, he shouted, and Mallory whirled, striking in that direction, catching a goblin across the ear. It howled. Rapier blades don't have points. They sure stung when they hit. Shorter! They're shorter! Jared managed to pull himself to his feet so that he was standing with his back against Mallory's. All 5 goblins were circling them. One lunged from the right. 3 o'clock, Jared shouted. Mallory knocked the goblin to the ground easily. 12 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 7 o'clock. They were rushing all at once, and Jared didn't think Mallory could possibly manage. He hefted the field guide and swung it as hard as he could at the nearest goblin. Whack! The book hit the goblin hard enough to send it sprawling backward. Mallory had knocked down 2 more with hard blows. Now they circled more warily, gnashing teeth of glass and stone. There was a strange call, like a cross between a bark and a whistle. At that sound, the goblins retreated one by one into the woods. Jared collapsed onto the grass. His side hurt, and he was out of breath. They're gone, Jared said. He held out the stone to Mallory. Look. Mallory sat down next to him and held it up to her eye. I don't see anything, but I didn't see anything a minute ago either. They still might come back. Jared rolled over and opened the guide, flipping through the pages quickly. Read this. Goblins travel in roving bands looking for trouble. Mallory scowled at the words. And look, Jared, cats and dogs missing is a sign that goblins are in the area. They exchanged a glance. Tibbs, Jared said with a shudder. Mallory read on. Goblins are born without teeth, and so find substitutes, such as the fangs of animals, sharp rocks, and pieces of glass. But it doesn't say anything about how to stop them, said Jared, or where they might have taken Simon. Mallory didn't look up from the page. Jared tried to keep his mind from imagining what the goblins might want with Simon. It seemed pretty obvious to him what they did with the cats and dogs, but he didn't want to believe that his brother could be eaten. His gaze fell on the illustration of those horrible teeth. Surely not. Surely there was some other explanation. Mallory took a deep breath and pointed to the illustration. It's going to be dark soon. And with eyes like that, they probably have better night vision than we do. That was pretty smart. Jared resolved to write a note in the guide about it when they got Simon back. He took off the eyepiece and slid the stone into place again, but the clamps were too loose to hold it. It doesn't work, Jared said. You have to adjust it, said Mallory. We need a screwdriver or something. Jared took a pocket knife from the back pocket of his pants. It had a screwdriver, a little knife, a magnifying glass, a file, bent scissors, and a place there where there had once been a toothpick. Screwing down the clamps carefully, he fitted the stones into place. Here, let me tie it on your head right. Mallory knotted the leather straps until the monocle apparatus was on tight. Jared had to squint a little to see properly, but it was much better than before. Take this, Mallory said, and handed him a practice rapier. The end wasn't pointed, though, so he wasn't sure how much real damage it could do. Still, it felt better to be armed. Tucking the guide into his backpack, tightening the straps, and holding the sword in front of him, Jared started back down the hill into the darkening woods. It was time to find Simon. Chapter 4, in which Jared and Mallory find many things, but not what they're looking for. Stepping into the woods, Jared felt a slight chill. The air was different, full of the smell of green things and fresh dirt, but the light was murky. He and Mallory stepped through tangles of jewelweed and past thin trees heaped with vines. Somewhere above them a bird started calling, making a harsh sound like an alarm. Beneath their footsteps the ground was slick with moss. Twigs snapped as they passed, and Jared heard the distant sound of water. There was a streak of brown, and a small owl settled on a low branch, its head cocked toward them as it bit into the small, limp mouse in its claw. Mallory pushed through a knot of bushes, and Jared followed. Tiny burrs caught on his clothes and in his hair. They sidled around the crumbling trunk of a fallen tree, swarming with black ants. There was something different about his vision with the stone in place. Everything was brighter and more clear. There was something else, too. Things moved in the grass, in the trees, things he couldn't quite see, but was aware of for the first time. Faces made of bark and rock and moss that he only saw for an instant. It was as though the whole of the forest was alive. There, Mallory fingered a broken branch and pointed to where clumps of ferns had been trampled. That's the way they went. They followed the trail of smashed weeds and snapped branches until they came to a stream. By then, the woods had grown more shadowed and the twilight sounds had increased. A cloud of gnats settled on them for a moment, then blew out toward the water. What do we do now? Mallory asked. Can you see anything? Jared squinted through the eyepiece and shook his head. Let's just follow the stream. The trail has to pick up again. They walked on through the forest. Mallory, Jared whispered, pointing at a huge oak tree. Tiny green and brown creatures were perched on a branch. Their wings resembled leaves, but their faces seemed almost human. Instead of hair, grass and flower buds grew from their tiny heads. What are you looking at? Mallory raised her rapier and took 2 steps backward. Jared shook his head slightly. Sprites, I think. Why do you have that stupid expression on your face? They're just... He couldn't quite explain. He extended his hand, palm up, and stared in amazement as one of the creatures alighted on his finger. Soft feet tickled his skin as the tiny fairy blinked up at him with black eyes. Jared, Mallory said impatiently. At the sound of her voice, the sprite jumped into the air. Jared watched as it spiraled upward into the leaves above. The patches of sunlight filtering through the trees became tinged with orange. Up ahead, the stream widened where it ran under the remains of a stone bridge. So that's one of the sprites. Jared could feel his skin prickle as they got closer to the rubble, but there was no sign of goblins. The stream was very wide, almost 20 feet across, and there was a darkness in the middle that seemed to speak deep water. Jared heard a distant sound like metal grating against metal. Mallory stopped, looking across the water, and raised her head. Did you hear that? Could it be Simon? Jared asked. He hoped it wasn't. It didn't sound human at all. I don't know, Mallory said, but whatever it was, it's got something to do with those goblins. Come on. With that, Mallory bounded in the direction of the noise. "Don't go in there, Mallory," Jared said. "It's too deep." "Don't be a baby," she said, and waded into the stream. She made 2 long strides and then dropped as though she had stepped off the edge of a cliff. Dark green water closed over her head. Jared lunged forward, dropping his rapier onto the bank. He plunged his hand into icy cold water. His sister bobbed to the surface, sputtering. She grabbed for his arm. He had pulled her halfway onto the bank when something began to surface behind her. At first it seemed like a hill rising from the water, stony and covered in moss. Then a head emerged, the deep green of rotten river grass, with small black eyes, and a nose that was gnarled like a branch, and a mouth full of cracked teeth. A hand reached toward them. Its fingers were as long as roots, and its nails were black with murk. Jared breathed in the stench of the bottom of the pool, putrid leaves, and old, old mud. He screamed. His mind went completely blank. He couldn't move. Mallory pulled herself the rest of the way onto the bank and looked over her shoulder. "What is it? What do you see?" At her voice, Jared snapped into moving and stumbled woodenly away from the stream, tugging her along with him. "Troll!" he gasped. The creature lunged after them. Long fingers dragged through the grass just short of where they were. Then the creature howled, and Jared looked back, but he couldn't see what had happened. It felt toward them again, but jerked away when one long finger fell into a beam of light. The monster bellowed. "The sun," Jared said. "It got burned by the sun." "There's not much sun left," Mallory replied. "Let's go." "Wait," the monster whispered. Its voice was soft. Yellow eyes regarded them steadily. "Come back. I have something for you." The troll extended a closed hand as though something might indeed be clutched in its palm. "Jared, come on." Mallory's voice was almost pleading. "I can't see what you're talking to." "Have you seen my brother?" Jared asked. "Perhaps. I heard something a time ago, but it was bright. Too bright to look." "That was him. It must have been. Where did they go?" The head swung toward the remnants of the bridge and then looked back at Jared. "Come closer, and I will tell you." Jared took a step back. "No way." "At least come get your sword." The troll gestured to the rapier beside itself. The sword was lying on the bank where Jared had dropped it. He looked over at his sister. Her hands were empty too. She must have left her sword at the bottom of the pool. Mallory took a half step forward. "It's the only weapon we have." "Come and take it. I will close my eyes if it will make you feel safer." One huge hand covered its eyes. Mallory looked at the sword in the mud. Her eyes focused on it in a way that made Jared very nervous. She was thinking about trying for it. "You can't even see the thing," Jared hissed. "Let's go." "But the sword." Jared untied the eyepiece and held it out to her. Her face went pale at the sight of the massive creature peeking through a gap in its fingers, imprisoned only by the fading patches of sunlight. "Come on," she said shakily. "No," called the troll. "Come back. I'll even turn around. I'll count to 10. It'll be a fair chance. Come back." Jared and Mallory ran on through the woods until they found a patch of sunlight to stop in. Both leaned against the thick trunk of an oak and tried to catch their breath. Mallory was shivering. Jared didn't know if it was because she was soaked or because of the troll. He unzipped his sweatshirt, took it off, and handed it to her. "We're lost," Mallory said between gulps of air, "and we're unarmed." "At least we know they couldn't have crossed the stream," said Jared, struggling to tie the eyepiece back on his hand. "The troll would have gotten them for sure." But the sound was on the other side. Mallory kicked a tree, chipping off bark. Jared's nose caught the scent of something burning. It was faint, but he thought it smelled like scorched hair. "You smell that?" Jared asked. "That way," Mallory said. They crashed through the brush. They crashed through the brush, heedless of the scratches twigs and thorns made along their arms. Jared's thoughts were all of his brother and fire. "Look at this!" Mallory stopped abruptly. She reached into the grass and picked up a single brown shoe. "It's Simon's." "I know," Mallory said. She turned it over, but Jared couldn't see any clues except that it was muddy. "You don't think he's—" Jared couldn't bring himself to say it. "No, I don't." Mallory shoved the shoe in the front pocket of her sweatshirt. He nodded slowly, allowing himself to be convinced. A little farther, and the trees began to thin. They stepped out onto a highway. Black asphalt stretched off into the distant horizon. Behind it all, the sun was setting in a blaze of purple and orange. And on the shoulder of the road, in the distance, a group of goblins huddled around a fire.